Killers of the Flower Moon. A haunting journey of fear, freedom, and the unseen truth. Hook. Have you ever felt like you're running from your past, haunted by shadows that never seem to fade? What if there was a place where the darkness could no longer reach you, where peace wasn't just a dream, but a reality? In this gripping story, join Thomas on a journey through fear, hope, and unexpected freedom, one that could change everything you thought you knew about escape. Stay tuned till the end to uncover the shocking truth about what comes next, and the choice that could define everything. The night was thick with silence. Only the rustle of dry leaves broke the stillness. The moon hung low, casting long shadows over the earth. A cold wind whispered through the trees. Thomas stood still, feeling the weight of the air. His boots crunched on the gravel path. Each step felt like a countdown. His breath came in short, steady bursts. A distant howl of an animal pierced the quiet. It echoed off the hills, a warning, perhaps. But nothing was out of place. Nothing except the eyes watching from the darkness. He could feel them, staring, there, in the corner of his vision. He quickly turned, but nothing moved. The forest was empty. He had to keep moving. The house was just ahead. It was an old, decaying thing, barely standing. The windows were dark, lifeless. He could see the door, slightly ajar. His heart began to race. The wind howled louder now, tugging at his coat. He pushed the door open. The floor creaked under his weight. The smell of damp wood and decay hit him. It was cold inside, too cold for a house that should have been abandoned. He stepped further, his breath fogging in the air. The air felt wrong, heavy, as if something was waiting. He swallowed, the unease building inside him. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, soft, almost like a breath against his ear. His body froze. Thomas. The voice was hoarse, strained. His name echoed in the empty house. He spun around, searching the shadows, but no one was there, only the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't alone. He could feel it now. Something was in the room. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and curling. The floor groaned. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approached him from behind. He turned, but saw nothing. Then a shape, a figure, tall and thin, barely visible in the dim light. It moved closer. The room felt smaller, tighter. The figure's face was pale, expressionless. Thomas's blood ran cold. His breath hitched. It was them, the killers. They had found him, and there was no escape. Not now. Not ever. The figure's hand reached out, slow and deliberate. Fingers stretched like claws. Thomas stepped back, his legs trembling. His eyes locked on the figure's face. No features, no eyes. Just a pale blur. The air thickened, pressing in on him. His heartbeat drowned out the world. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the tension. A door slammed in the distance. The figure paused. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the floorboards creaked beneath him. Thomas stumbled backward, falling against the wall. His breath was ragged, shallow. The figure didn't move. It just watched. The whispering grew louder. Faint voices like a chant, low and murmuring, crawling into his mind. They were speaking to him, calling him closer. He felt his body pull forward against his will. Each step toward the figure felt like dragging through thick mud. His body fought it, but something else was in control. His pulse surged, pounding in his ears. A terrible warmth spread through him. The house seemed to pulse with it, alive and breathing. Then, a sudden crash. The door flew open. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight. Thomas, a voice familiar, desperate. He snapped out of the trance, gasping for air. The figure in front of him twitched. Then it lunged. Too fast, too sudden. Thomas barely had time to react. His hand shot out, grabbing the nearest thing, a rusty pipe. He swung with everything he had. The blow landed with a sickening thud. The figure stumbled back, but didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It grinned if it could. The sound was wrong, distorted. He couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in. The shadows seemed to grow teeth. Something was wrong with the world. Something was slipping through, and it was hungry. Thomas tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His breath came in short gasps, his vision blurring. The figure moved closer again, its hand reaching for him. A scream died in his throat. But then, the door behind him slammed open once more. More figures stepped inside. They were too many for him to fight. They circled him. The last thing he saw was the pale face of one, smiling. Then darkness. Complete, unfeeling darkness. The darkness was suffocating. Cold, oppressive. Thomas couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on him. And then a flicker. A distant light. It pulsed once, then again like a heartbeat. His senses slowly returned. The taste of metal lingered in his mouth. The room felt familiar, but twisted, like a nightmare where everything was wrong. The shadows had stopped moving. The figures gone. He was alone again, but that didn't mean he was safe. The floor beneath him was damp, sticky. He tried to push himself up, but his arms were weak. His head spun. The flickering light continued, just ahead. He crawled toward it, each movement slow and deliberate. His mind raced. What had happened? What was real? His fingers brushed the cold, hard floor. He reached out for the light, and as he did, something cold wrapped around his wrist. A tug, a pull. His heart stopped. The whispering returned, louder this time. The voices seemed to come from everywhere. They swarmed around him, inside his head. Their words blurred together, unintelligible. But he understood. He understood enough. The killers weren't just in the house. They were in his mind, in his very blood. He felt it. Something deep inside him, turning, twisting. It was them. Their presence was inside him now, their hands in his veins. And with that realization, a strange calm settled over him. He had no escape. None of them did. The light flickered one last time. Then everything went dark again. No sound, no breath, just the endless pull of the shadows. And the quiet echo of the killer's voices, the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. No breath, no movement. Thomas floated, disembodied, trapped in the endless dark. But then his eyes snapped open. A cold gasp filled his lungs. He was back in the house. The walls were crumbling, peeling. Rot and decay seeped into the very air. His hands trembled as he pushed himself to his feet. Something was different. The house felt alive. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the floorboards, seemed to pulse with malice. He could feel it now, those eyes, those cold, invisible eyes watching him. He turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing moved, but the shadows were deeper now, thicker. The light ahead flickered once more. Faint, ghostly. A shape stood in the corner of the room, hidden by the dark. Thomas froze. It wasn't one of them. This figure was different. Tall, slender, but not unnatural. Its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but its presence was undeniable. It moved toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air grew colder as it drew nearer. The whispering voices in his head grew frantic and sharp. He couldn't understand them, but the feeling of dread was unbearable. The figure stopped just inches away, standing silent. Thomas couldn't breathe. The figure reached up, removing the hat slowly, and in that moment, time seemed to slow. The face that emerged was human, but it was not. It was twisted, stretched, like the skin had been pulled too tight. Eyes that were wide, unblinking, empty, hollow sockets that stared right through him. And then the mouth opened, but no sound came. It didn't need to speak. The air grew colder still. The room seemed to cave in around him. The walls were pressing in, suffocating him. He gasped, his breath shallow. His heart pounded so hard, it felt like it would tear through his chest. The figure's hands reached forward, slow and deliberate. And then a scream tore through the room, the house, the world. It was his scream, but it wasn't. It was the sound of something being ripped apart, something in him. And in that moment, everything shattered. The darkness consumed him. The whispers, the cold, the figure, all of it, gone. But the eyes, the endless eyes, remained, staring, always watching. The eyes never left. They were everywhere. 1,000 pairs, all staring. He couldn't escape. The air was thick with their weight. And the whispers, they never stopped. Their voices clawed at his thoughts, pounding into his skull. His hands gripped his head, trying to block them out. But they were inside now, inside him. A cold laugh echoed from somewhere, a sound that crawled under his skin, and then his body jerked. A surge of energy shot through him, uninvited, uncontrollable. It was as if something had taken hold of him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then he felt it, a pull, a magnetic force tugging at his insides. His limbs shook, his skin burned. The floor beneath him began to warp and stretch. The walls seemed to melt, bending at impossible angles. He was no longer in the house. The very fabric of reality had torn open. He was falling, sinking into an endless abyss of blackness, a world that was nothing but shadows, cold, empty shadows that pressed in on him. Then a voice, low and rasping, spoke directly into his mind. "You're ours now." His body screamed, but his mouth wouldn't open. The darkness swirled around him. He tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the ground, frozen. The shadows were pulling him deeper, deeper into something he couldn't escape, something he didn't understand, a darkness that wasn't just outside him. It was inside, too, tightening around his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. And there, in the depths of that crushing dark, he saw them. The killers. Their faces were all around him, pale, twisted, eyes staring, mouth stretched into silent grins. They circled him, closing in, and he could hear their laughter, low, guttural, as if the world itself was laughing at him. His heart pounded, his vision blurred. The darkness swallowed him whole, and just as everything went black, he felt it, a final tug, a pull so strong, so relentless, that it tore him apart, into nothing. Nothing at all. The nothingness was suffocating. He had no form, no body, no sensation, only the deep, gnawing emptiness, a void so vast, so cold, it felt as though time itself had stopped. But then, a crack, a jagged line split the blackness. A faint glow leaked through, fragile, flickering. Thomas could feel it pulling him, beckoning him closer. He didn't want to move. He didn't want to. But something inside him urged him forward. He reached out. His hand found something solid. The ground. It was hard, cold. It wasn't the abyss anymore. But it wasn't right. The light was stronger now. He blinked. His surroundings began to take shape. The floor was cracked, broken in places, but it was real. He could feel the rough texture under his fingertips. And then he heard it again. That sound. The whispering. Closer this time. Louder. No, not just louder, clearer. Thomas. It was his name. Unmistakable. He pushed himself up, his legs shaking. He was back in the house. But it wasn't the same house. It was darker, rotting. The walls were bleeding, oozing something black and foul. The air was thick with the stench of decay. And they were here. The killers. They were watching. Their pale faces gleamed from the shadows, eyes wide and hungry. He felt their gaze on him like a weight, a suffocating pressure. But this time he could move. His body wasn't frozen. His breath was shallow but steady. He stumbled forward, fighting the pull of the shadows. There was a door ahead, cracked open just a sliver of light. He reached it, his heart pounding in his chest. The floor creaked beneath him, each step an agonizing echo. Then he stopped. The door. It was wide open now. Beyond it, a figure stood, tall, too tall. Its head brushed the ceiling. Its face was hidden in darkness, but he could feel it, that presence. It was waiting for him. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. The door slammed shut behind him. He was trapped. The figure in front of him didn't move. Its hands were long and bony, reaching out for him. "Leave," the voice whispered. "Leave before it's too late." But Thomas didn't move. He couldn't. The shadowed figure grinned, a smile too wide for any human. And slowly it stepped closer, 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 until its face hovered just inches from his own. The darkness in its eyes, endless, cold. It spoke again, softer this time. "You're one of us now." The whisper was final, and with that, everything went dark once more. But this time, Thomas didn't scream. He didn't fight, because he knew. The darkness had claimed him. The darkness pressed in like a heavy blanket. Thomas was weightless, adrift. No ground beneath his feet, no sky above him. Only that suffocating void. But he could still feel it. The presence. It was there, lurking, watching, waiting. He could hear the whispers again, clearer this time, almost as if they were speaking directly into his mind. A voice, a low, guttural tone, spoke. "Welcome to the other side." Thomas wanted to scream, but his throat was dry. No sound came. The shadows around him seemed to ripple, like they were alive. The air was thick, full of something ancient, something hungry, and then a sensation, faint but unmistakable. A tug, a pull. It was the same as before, that crushing force that yanked him toward the darkness. He fought it, but his body moved on its own. His legs, his arms, they weren't his anymore. The pull was too strong. Closer and closer he was drawn. And then a shift. The shadows gave way to something else. A shape just ahead. A figure. It wasn't the same as before. It was familiar. Too familiar. The air grew colder. Thomas could see it now, his own face. Twisted, pale. A grim smile stretched across it. It was him, but not him. A reflection distorted. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing his cheek. He flinched. The figure's eyes were hollow, endless, and in those eyes he saw it. The truth. The same truth he had ignored, pushed away for so long. "You were always one of us," the figure whispered. Thomas tried to speak, to ask, but his voice was gone. The darkness swirled around him, and the figure's face seemed to split, like the ground was cracking open. The air buzzed, heavy with 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. The shadows surrounded him, pressing tighter, and as the figure's hand wrapped around his throat, pulling him into the endless abyss, Thomas finally understood. He had never escaped. The killers of the Flower Moon had claimed him, body and soul. And now there was no light. Only the darkness. Only them. The hand tightened around his throat. The pressure was unbearable. His breath came in ragged gasps, but it was useless. The darkness pressed harder, folding over him like an endless wave. He couldn't fight. His body was too weak, too lost. His eyes flickered, unable to focus on anything but the cold grip tightening on his neck. The whispers grew louder, louder still, echoing all around him. "Come closer," they hissed. "We're waiting." The figure in front of him smiled, that same twisted grin. The face was his, yet not, and in that face he saw it. The truth that had always been there, hidden in the corners of his mind. He had never escaped. This was never just about the house. It was about the curse that had been passed down from one soul to the next. The killers of the Flower Moon were not just men. They were shadows. They were whispers. They were memories. And now they were him. The darkness seemed to expand, to swallow everything. He felt himself fading, slipping from reality, from time. The figure's eyes, hollow and endless, stared into him. "Join us," it whispered again. "Become one with the darkness." Thomas struggled to breathe, his chest heaving in vain. The walls around him seemed to pulse, as if alive. It was all collapsing, folding in on itself. His vision blurred. His mind raced, trying to hold on to something, anything. But the pull of the darkness was too strong. It was all-consuming. He felt his body start to dissolve, becoming part of the shadow. The last remnants of his mind screamed in terror, but it was too late. The figure's face shifted, and in that final, fleeting moment, it wasn't just Thomas looking back at him. It was all of them, the killers, the cursed souls who had wandered, lost and hungry, for far too long, and now they had him. The last thought that flickered through his mind before everything went black was simple. It was never about escape. It was always about being taken. And now, there was nothing left to fight, nothing left to fear, just the endless darkness, just the endless whispers, and the cold, hollow eyes watching from every corner of the void. Time no longer had meaning. The darkness had become his world, his existence. There was no past, no future, only the endless, suffocating now. But even in that infinite void, something shifted. A crack appeared, small at first, like the flicker of a distant flame. It spread, splitting the blackness, a sliver of light cutting through the shadows. Thomas felt the pull again, not the suffocating weight, but something different. A strange tug. He reached for it, instinctively. His body, though foreign and fading, responded to the call. The light grew brighter, warmer. It felt like a memory, something buried deep in his mind. He fought through the overwhelming silence, through the whispers clawing at his thoughts. A figure emerged in the light. This one was different, not twisted, not shadowed. The figure stood tall, its form sharp against the dim glow. Thomas couldn't see its face, but there was something familiar about it, a presence, gentle yet powerful. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the darkness seemed to retreat, just a little. The whispers quieted. "You're not lost yet," the figure said, its voice like a distant echo. The words hung in the air, unfamiliar and heavy. Thomas felt something stir within him, a spark. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers warm against his cold skin. "Come back," it whispered. "You can still find your way." The tug was stronger now, pulling him toward the light. His limbs, though weak, moved of their own accord, pushing through the shadows. And then, as if the world had been waiting for him to make a choice, the darkness shattered. In an instant, everything changed. The cold, suffocating blackness faded away, replaced by warmth and light. The air was clear, the ground solid beneath his feet. Thomas stood, breathing deeply, his chest rising and falling with each painful breath. The figure was still there, standing in front of him. It stepped aside, revealing a path ahead, a long, winding road, bathed in pale moonlight. "Go," the figure said softly. "This is your choice." Thomas looked ahead. He didn't know where the road would lead. He didn't know if he could trust it. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt the smallest flicker of hope. The light was brighter now, illuminating the path before him. And for the first time, he moved forward, one step at a time, away from the shadows, away from the killers. The road stretched before him, endless but inviting. Each step was a weight lifted, a small victory. The shadows, though still present, seemed to shrink with every step he took. The moonlight guided him, soft and constant, like an old friend. Thomas didn't look back. He couldn't. Something deep inside urged him to keep moving forward, to not let the darkness catch up. The road was long, winding through an empty landscape. Bare trees loomed like skeletal figures, their branches reaching for the sky in twisted shapes. The wind whispered through the branches, but there were no voices this time. No whispers clawing at his mind. The air was crisp, fresh, almost alive, but there was still something haunting about it, a feeling of being watched. His pulse quickened, the faintest sensation that the killers, those shadowed figures, were still there, just beyond the edge of his vision. But he kept walking. Each step felt more certain than the last. The road beneath his feet began to change. The ground grew softer, smoother, as though the earth itself was responding to his presence. The trees thinned, and ahead in the distance he could see something, a light, not the pale, flickering kind that haunted the shadows, but a steady, warm glow. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. He quickened his pace, driven by a need to reach it, to escape the weight of everything behind him. With each step, the light grew closer. And then, as he neared, he saw it. A door, wooden and ancient, but standing firm, bathed in that soft light. It was the kind of door you'd find in stories, an entrance to something beyond. The killers, the darkness, the endless void, all of it felt so far behind him now. Thomas reached for the door, his hand trembling slightly as it touched the old brass handle. He turned it, and the door creaked open. Beyond it, nothing but blinding light. He stepped forward without hesitation. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, a wave of warmth rushed over him. His body felt light, unburdened by the darkness, the weight, the fear. He had crossed the line. The road, the trees, the figure, everything faded behind him. And for the first time in what seemed like a lifetime, Thomas felt free. The whispers were gone, the killers gone, and the light, the pure, unwavering light, wrapped him in its embrace. There was no turning back, but there was no need. He had found his way, and in that moment, the darkness was nothing but a distant memory. The light surrounding him was pure, all-encompassing, like a second birth. It wasn't blinding, but rather, it filled him with a sense of calm, of knowing. Thomas stood still, feeling the warmth of it settle in his bones, erasing the weight of everything that had followed him. The road, the shadows, the figures, they were all gone, as if they had never existed. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to comprehend the peace that flooded him. There was no sound here, only a quiet hum, like the world itself was breathing softly. A sense of presence surrounded him. But it wasn't the suffocating presence of the darkness. It was different, lighter, gentle, and in that stillness a voice echoed, not through his ears, but in his very mind. "You've made it." The words were soft, but they carried weight. It was the same voice that had spoken to him before, guiding him forward through the darkness. The figure. Thomas opened his eyes, expecting to see it again, but there was nothing, only the light. "Where am I?" he whispered to the emptiness. The voice answered, clear and knowing. "You are where the darkness cannot follow." A deep, comforting truth settled within him. Thomas didn't need to ask more. He understood now. Everything, the killers, the suffering, the chase, it had all led him here, to this place beyond the reach of shadows. But a part of him hesitated. The world he had left behind still clung to him, even in this place of peace. The memory of the killer's eyes, the way they had watched him, the way they had haunted him. "Will they ever stop chasing me?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. There was a pause. Then the voice returned, soft and certain. "They have no power here." Thomas felt a wave of relief, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from him. For the first time, he wasn't running. The nightmare was over. And yet, as he stood there in the stillness, he realized something else. He was no longer the man who had entered this place. He had crossed through something that had changed him. But in this quiet space, he could be free. The light around him deepened, swirling, offering no answer but a sense of belonging. And as he walked further into the warmth, toward whatever lay ahead, he no longer feared what he had left behind. The killers of the Flower Moon were gone. And for the first time in his life, Thomas truly knew what it meant to be free. That as Thomas walked deeper into the light, the feeling of freedom intensified. The ground beneath him felt soft, like walking on clouds, and every step seemed to dissolve the remnants of fear and doubt that had clung to him for so long. There was no sound here, no distractions, only a profound silence that soothed the raw edges of his soul. He was weightless, as though the past, with all its horrors, had no hold on him anymore. The warmth of the light wrapped around him, filling the empty spaces where pain and darkness had once dwelled. And yet, in the stillness, something stirred inside him, a faint echo of the past. He remembered the figures, the killers, their hollow eyes, their cold hands. Even in this place of peace, their presence lingered, like shadows that refused to vanish entirely. Thomas halted, standing still, his heart beating faster now, his thoughts racing. Could it be that they would find a way to follow him? Could they find a crack in this endless light? The voice, soft and gentle, answered before he could ask. "They can never reach you here." The words felt like a promise, but there was something more in them, something ancient and powerful. Thomas looked around, hoping to see the source of the voice, but all he saw was the ever-present light, the emptiness, and then, slowly, shapes began to form in the distance. At first, they were just vague outlines, figures standing in the glowing haze. But as they grew closer, Thomas saw them clearly. They were like him, tattered and worn, lost and drifting. Souls, all of them. Some of their faces were familiar, faces from his past, lost memories he thought he had buried. Others were strangers, faces that seemed to have emerged from the very fabric of the light itself. They moved toward him with the same sense of purpose, walking as though they had always been here, part of this place that existed beyond time and space. One of them stepped forward, a figure tall and regal, with eyes that shone with a quiet, knowing strength. It looked at him, its expression soft, almost reassuring. "You are not alone," it said. The words hung in the air, settling deep inside him. Thomas glanced around, realizing then that this was a place for all the lost souls, the ones who had wandered, haunted by darkness, by fear, by guilt, and they had found peace. But even here, a part of him wondered, what did it all mean? Was peace enough? Could he ever truly leave the past behind? The figure smiled, sensing his hesitation. "It is not about forgetting," it said, its voice like a soothing balm to his troubled mind. "It is about finding a place where you can be whole again." And in that moment, Thomas understood. This place, this light, wasn't just an escape. It was a rebirth, a place for souls to heal, to find solace. And as the figures gathered around him, the warmth of their presence felt like a blanket wrapping him in something he had lost long ago, belonging. He looked up at the endless light above him, a soft, peaceful glow that seemed to stretch into eternity. Here, in this place beyond time, he had found what he had been searching for all along, peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas allowed himself to rest. To simply be. The light around him seemed to deepen, becoming a rich, golden hue, as though the very air was alive with energy, gentle and pulsing. The faces of the souls who had gathered around him softened, their expressions no longer burdened by the weight of their pasts. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like dancers in a quiet ballet, each step a part of the healing process, a release from the memories that had once trapped them. Thomas stood among them, still, but feeling something within him shift, like the very essence of his being was adjusting to the peace around him. His thoughts were clearer now, sharper, no longer clouded by the terror of the dark or the endless chase that had defined his existence for so long. The figure who had stepped forward earlier, the one with the knowing eyes, approached him once again. There was no urgency in its movement, just a calm that radiated from its presence. It reached out a hand, not in expectation, but in offering. Without thinking, Thomas took it. "Do you understand now?" the figure asked, its voice both gentle and wise, like the whisper of the wind through trees. Thomas looked into its eyes, feeling a connection that went beyond words, beyond the need for explanation. It wasn't about understanding everything, not about conquering every fear or chasing every shadow from the past. "It's about peace," he said softly, the realization finally settling into his chest. "It's about finding a place where the darkness can't reach me." The figure nodded, its eyes brightening, as though Thomas had spoken the truest truth there was. "Yes," it said simply, "this is where you are meant to be, where all of you is meant to heal." A sense of completeness washed over him, deeper than anything he had ever known. He had been running for so long, chasing shadows, haunted by the killers, by the echoes of a past he couldn't escape. But here, in this space, he could finally stop. The other souls began to move with more purpose now, not in a hurry, but with a quiet understanding that there was something to be experienced here, something to be shared. Thomas followed their lead, not sure what it was, but trusting the moment. The landscape around them shifted subtly, as though the light itself was fluid, ever-changing. The golden glow deepened to amber, and the ground beneath his feet became soft, like moss, with gentle, rolling hills leading into valleys filled with a mist so delicate it seemed to shimmer with the light. Thomas walked along, the path before him stretching far and wide, but it no longer seemed daunting. There was no fear of what lay ahead, only an openness, a welcoming sense that whatever was next was a part of the journey, and that he was not alone. The figure who had first guided him stepped beside him, its hand still resting gently on his shoulder. "Here," the figure said, "you will find what you need." Thomas didn't ask what that meant. He simply nodded, and as the landscape unfolded around him, each new turn of the path felt like a step forward into something he had always been meant to experience, a peace that would stay with him, eternal and unbroken, in this place where the darkness could never touch him again. Here, the killers of the flower moon could never reach him. The path stretched on, winding through soft meadows and tranquil valleys, each step carrying Thomas further into the light. The air around him was cool, but filled with a sense of calm, like the silence between raindrops on a quiet night. The souls around him moved with purpose, but not urgency. They walked, talked in hushed tones, their presence a quiet reassurance. Thomas felt no need to rush. Each moment seemed to unfold on its own, with nothing pressing him forward except his own pace. The landscape continued to shift as they walked. The meadows gave way to towering trees with branches that reached up like ancient hands, their leaves shimmering in hues of silver and gold. The sky above was a soft gradient, a peaceful blend of twilight and dawn, neither day nor night. It was a realm beyond time, a space where the concept of past and future no longer seemed relevant. Only now, only the present mattered. Thomas felt the weight of everything he had left behind. The killers, the fear, the endless pursuit, begin to fade, dissolving into the earth beneath his feet, blending with the landscape. Here, there was no past to haunt him. There was only peace. He glanced at the figure beside him, still walking with calm grace. It didn't speak anymore, but Thomas felt its presence beside him, guiding him silently. It was as if the figure was not just a guide, but a reflection of something deeper within himself, a part of him that had always known how to find peace, how to heal. "Do you think," Thomas began quietly, his voice almost lost in the gentle hum of the place, "that I'll ever truly forget what happened?" The figure didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Thomas thought maybe it hadn't heard him. But then the voice came, soft but certain, like the breeze that whispered through the trees. "No," the figure said, "you won't forget, but it will no longer control you. The darkness is behind you now, not ahead." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. It wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding a place where the past didn't have power over him anymore, where the fear no longer held him in its grip. They continued to walk, and the path ahead began to brighten, not in blinding light, but in a gentle, welcoming glow. It was a light that felt like home, warm, inviting, full of quiet understanding. As they neared the edge of the path, Thomas could see something in the distance. A small, serene lake lay before them, its surface as still as glass, reflecting the sky above. The air was heavier here, filled with the scent of wildflowers and earth. He took a step toward it, the quiet lapping of water, calling to him like an old song. "Is this where it ends?" he asked, his voice low, as he stopped before the water. The figure stopped beside him, and for a moment there was no answer. The figure simply looked at the lake, the water reflecting their faces, rippling with the breeze. "Not an end," the figure finally said, "but a beginning, a new path, a place to rest, to heal." Thomas gazed out over the water, his reflection now mingling with the light that seemed to glow from within the lake itself. For the first time, he felt truly at peace. The killers, the shadows, the endless chase, they were no longer his burden. They had been left behind, faded into the distant past, swallowed by the light that surrounded him. And in the stillness of the lake, Thomas saw something he had never dared to look for before. Himself. Whole. Unbroken. He let out a long breath, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. Here, in this place beyond time and darkness, he had found something that had eluded him for so long. Not just peace, but the freedom to live without fear. The water shimmered, a gentle reminder that sometimes the hardest journey is the one inward. And now, he was home. The water rippled gently, the soft waves creating patterns that shimmered under the ethereal light. Thomas stood there for a long moment, feeling the peaceful rhythm of the lake, the steady pull of the light around him, as if the world itself was breathing in time with him. He didn't speak, only breathed, soaking in the calm that surrounded him. His heart felt lighter, as though the weight of 1,000 storms had finally passed. As he stood by the water, the figure beside him finally moved again, but not away from him. It gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a reassuring gesture, grounded yet uplifting. "You've come far," the figure said, its voice carrying a quiet pride. "This is where you can stay, or where you can choose to move forward." Thomas turned toward it slowly, his mind racing with the gravity of the words. "Move forward," he echoed. "I don't understand. I've left everything behind. The darkness, the killers." The figure nodded. "You've left behind what can never follow you here. But there are always new paths. The journey never ends, Thomas. Not in the way you think." Thomas looked down at the lake again, the stillness of it speaking to him in ways words couldn't. The light, the soothing hum in the air. It had given him everything he needed, more than he had ever hoped for. But the figure's words planted a seed of curiosity, a question that had quietly lingered in his mind ever since he stepped into this place. "What happens if I choose to move forward?" Thomas asked, the words tasting unfamiliar on his tongue, uncertain yet hopeful. "What's beyond this place?" The figure's gaze softened, and there was a knowing smile that touched its lips, as though it could see the conflict in his eyes, the yearning for something more. "You may leave behind the darkness, but the light you have found within yourself will always guide you. Whether it is here or somewhere else." Thomas pondered the words, feeling a deep resonance within them, like a truth buried deep in his heart. What would he do with this peace? Could it truly be enough to live forever in the quiet of this place, basking in the light that had healed him? For the first time in a long time, he felt no urgency, no pressure to make a decision. There was no wrong choice. There was only possibility. And for the first time, he realized that the fear of being lost had always been tied to his belief that there was a destination to reach, a place to escape to, a final resting point where everything would be perfect. But the truth was, the journey wasn't about the end. It was about each step along the way. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs with the lightness he hadn't even known he was missing. He looked at the figure again, not with fear, but with a quiet understanding. "I think," Thomas began, his voice steady, "I'm ready to see what's beyond this place." The figure smiled, as though it had known all along that this was the moment. "Then go," it said, stepping back, the light parting to reveal the path that stretched forward, beyond the edge of the lake. "You will carry this peace with you, wherever you go." Thomas turned toward the path, the way forward now clear. The light was soft but unwavering, beckoning him onward. He took one final glance at the lake, the still water reflecting the vast, golden sky. And with that, he stepped forward, no longer bound by the shadows, no longer haunted by the killers. For the first time in his life, Thomas was free to walk into whatever came next, with the peace of the journey he had already completed surrounding him. And in that moment, he knew he would never be lost again. The path ahead of him stretched out like a promise, soft and gentle, yet full of untold possibilities. Each step Thomas took was lighter than the last, as though the very act of moving forward was shedding the weight of his past, of all the shadows, the fear, the suffocating chase. He didn't know where the path would lead, and for the first time, that didn't matter. There was no urgency, no desperation. Just the quiet rhythm of his footsteps, the steady pull of the light, and the knowledge that he was free. The light ahead began to intensify, not harshly, but warmly, as if welcoming him deeper into the journey. The air around him shimmered, carrying with it a sense of calm and understanding, a recognition that this was not the end, but the beginning of something new. Thomas walked for what felt like hours, though time here had lost all meaning. The landscape around him shifted again. Rolling hills gave way to gentle forests, the trees towering above him in a peaceful embrace. The leaves rustled, not with the wind, but with the sounds of distant whispers, like forgotten memories stirred by the soft breeze. And still, there was nothing but peace. As he walked, his thoughts wandered, not back to the killers, not back to the darkness. Instead, his mind focused on what lay ahead. What could it be? What was beyond this place? The question lingered in the back of his mind, but it didn't weigh him down. He had come to understand that the answer wasn't something that could be known ahead of time. It was something that could only be experienced, felt in the moment as it unfolded before him. And then, through the trees, he saw it. A clearing. At its center, a fountain. The water shimmering with the same soft light that had surrounded him since he first stepped onto this path. It was a simple fountain, unadorned, but in its presence, there was a profound sense of serenity. Thomas approached it slowly, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. As he neared the fountain, He noticed the water was clear, rippling gently as if stirred by an invisible hand. The surface reflected the sky above, no longer twilight, but a deep, rich blue, dotted with stars. He knelt beside the fountain, dipping his fingers into the cool water. It was refreshing, as though the water carried with it the very essence of this place, the peace, the healing, the light that had followed him all this way. He gazed at his reflection in the water, seeing himself not as he had been before, broken, haunted, lost, but as he was now, whole, unburdened, at peace. The reflection seemed to smile back at him, a soft expression, one that spoke of understanding and acceptance. "Is this where I'm meant to be?" he whispered to the stillness around him, unsure if the question was for himself or for the world that surrounded him. The water rippled, and as it did, the answer came, not in words, but in a feeling of completion. The journey wasn't about reaching a destination, Thomas realized. It was about each step, the way forward, the choices made, the acceptance of who he was and what he had endured. And now, as he gazed into the fountain, he understood that the peace he had found was not just an escape from the past, but the freedom to choose his future without fear. He stood, taking one last look at the fountain, the stars above, the quiet trees, the path that continued beyond the clearing. And with a deep breath, he turned and walked on. The light still beckoned, steady and unyielding, but now Thomas knew that whatever came next, he would face it with the peace that had guided him this far. And that peace, he knew, would never fade. Not as long as he kept moving forward, the path ahead stretched out in soft, undulating curves, inviting but mysterious. Each step felt like a new layer of discovery, like peeling back the quiet veil of the world he had entered. The air still carried that gentle warmth, the ever-present hum of peace wrapping around him, as if he were held in a place where time no longer mattered, where only the now existed. With each step, Thomas grew more certain of something he hadn't fully understood before. This journey wasn't linear. There was no finish line waiting for him, no grand destination where everything would suddenly make sense. It was the walk itself, the movement forward, the quiet exploration of what lay ahead that mattered. He glanced back at the fountain one last time, watching the soft ripples in the water dance in the faint light. It felt like a chapter closing, but not in a way that was sad or final. It was simply natural. He had found something there, something vital, but now it was time to move on. The trees ahead parted as the path opened into a wide valley. The horizon stretched far and wide, bathed in soft light, dotted with rolling hills. The landscape was alive, but not in the way that human eyes would expect. It was vibrant, yet still, like an image that was almost too perfect to be real. Thomas stopped at the edge of the valley, taking in the vastness of it. The colors were unlike anything he had ever seen. Rich hues of green and gold that seemed to shimmer even in the muted light, as if they were alive in a way he couldn't fully understand. He could feel the weight of his own thoughts lifting, replaced by a strange sense of belonging, as though this land, this place, had always been a part of him, and now, finally, he had found it. A soft breeze swept through the valley, rustling the grass, carrying with it the distant hum of life, a sound that wasn't quite music, but something close to it, an undertone that seemed to pulse with everything around him. And there, in the distance, something else appeared. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it moved closer, Thomas realized what it was. A figure walking toward him with purpose, yet not hurrying. The figure was tall, wearing flowing robes that seemed to shimmer as they caught the light. Its face was serene, its expression calm. But there was a familiarity in the way it moved, like it had been walking this path for as long as Thomas had existed. The figure stopped a few feet away from him, not intrusively, but enough to acknowledge his presence. "You've come far," the figure said, its voice like the wind through the trees, clear and warm. "But your journey is not over yet." Thomas blinked, surprised by the statement, though a part of him already knew what the figure was saying was true. This place, this moment, felt too peaceful, too perfect to be an ending. "I don't know if I'm ready to keep going," Thomas admitted, his voice soft, though he knew his words held the weight of something deeper. He had come so far. He had left behind the darkness, the killers, the terror. But in the quiet of this moment, he wasn't sure what more there was. The figure smiled, and there was a knowing in that smile, a wisdom that echoed from beyond the boundaries of this place. "Fear is not the enemy," it said. "It is the choice you make with it. This is not about moving away from something. It is about moving toward something." The words resonated deeply, and Thomas felt a stirring inside him. This place, this peace, it was not an escape, but a foundation. It wasn't the end of something, but the beginning of something new. The figure stepped aside, gesturing to the valley ahead. "Beyond this, there are more paths, more choices. The journey continues, as long as you are willing to walk it." Thomas stood for a long moment, looking out over the valley. The light was shifting again, changing in a subtle dance, as if beckoning him forward. He had never imagined that peace could feel like this, so open, so full of potential. And yet, here it was waiting for him to take that first step into whatever came next. And so he did. With one breath, one step, Thomas moved forward again. Not away from something, not to escape, but toward something, toward whatever the next chapter held. The light grew brighter, and as he walked, the valley seemed to open up before him, revealing more paths, more choices, each one leading somewhere new. This journey was far from over, and Thomas walked on, the weight of the past now completely lifted, his heart open to whatever was waiting ahead.